But nature, in its wild wisdom, does not always comply with the designs of human cruelty. A few feet away, a jaguar, majestic and silent, sniffed the air. It wasn't the scent of prey, but something more subtle, a vibration of desperate life muffled by the earth. An ancestral instinct, a primordial force made the beast stop, its amber eyes fixed on the freshly disturbed mound. There was something there, a fragility that cried out, a faint pulse beneath the surface. With a low growl, almost a lament, the jaguar began to dig. Powerful paws tore at the earth frantically, driven not by hunger, but by an inexplicable urgency, a wild need to unearth what human cruelty had tried to hide. Time was an enemy, but the jaguar, the true guardian of that land, would not give up. The earth flew, not in wind-blown dust clouds, but in violent bursts, driven by the instinctive fury of a jaguar. Each paw, a powerful shovel, tore at the damp soil with a speed and determination that defied logic. There was no hunger in its amber eyes, only a primordial urgency, a silent call that compelled it to unearth what human cruelty had tried to bury. The mound of fresh earth, once a monument to evil, was now a stage for a silent battle against time. A few feet away, inside the retreating pickup truck, Sophia's silhouette was a dark smudge against the twilight. A cold, satisfied smile played on her lips. The plan was perfect. The old woman finally out of the way. The farm, the inheritance, everything would be hers. No one would ever suspect. The earth would keep its secret, and the silence of the night would be her accomplice. She sped up, leaving behind not only the farm, but also the last trace of humanity she might once have possessed. But beneath the earth, Helena's private hell was a nightmare of darkness and suffocation. The thin air burned her lungs with every breath. The smell of wet earth and mold invaded her nostrils, mingling with terror. Her eyes, open in absolute darkness, tried uselessly to pierce the veil of imminent death. The coffin, tight, was a wooden straitjacket, and every minimal movement resulted in a sinister creak that echoed in her ears, amplifying the despair. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled, a hoarse lament that died in her own throat. Consciousness began to fail. Thoughts became fragmented. The image of Sophia, cold and relentless, was the last thing her clouded mind could retain. Then a sound, a distant, muffled but unmistakable noise, a scratching. It wasn't the wind nor the creaking of wood. It was a sound of impact, of something hitting the earth above her, followed by a frantic scraping. Was her mind playing tricks on her? The delirium of oxygen deprivation. She tried to concentrate, forcing her ears to decipher the mystery. The sound intensified, becoming clearer, more rhythmic. Thump, thump, scrape. Thump, thump, scrape. A subtle vibration began to travel through the wood of the coffin, a tremor coming from above. Outside, the jaguar gave no quarter. Its powerful muscles worked in perfect synchronicity, sharp claws tearing at clumps of earth, hind paws pushing its body back, clearing the way. The instinct guiding it was deeper than the hunt, older than hunger. It was the law of life, nature's balance, sensing an imbalance, a brutal injustice. The scent of life, previously faint, now grew stronger, mixed with the aroma of fear and despair. It growled low, a guttural sound of concentration and effort. With each layer of earth removed, the vibration of life below became clearer, a faint but persistent pulse. Inside the coffin, Helena felt the tremor increase. The scratching sound was now undeniable, and the air, for a brief moment, seemed less dense. A particle of hope, tiny and fragile like a flame in a storm, ignited in her chest. Someone. Something? The idea was absurd, but the sound was real. She gathered the last shred of strength, trying to push the coffin lid, but it was useless. The wood was heavy, the earth above her, an insurmountable mountain. The jaguar, with a final powerful paw strike, broke through the last layer of earth. What followed was not what was expected. It wasn't the wood of the coffin, but something softer, more pliable, The earth gave way, revealing not the lid but a crack, a hole that opened directly into the interior. A strong smell of life, of panicked humanity, flooded its nostrils, and through the crack, a pale thread of twilight light penetrated the infernal darkness. Helena, with eyes almost closed from exhaustion and terror, felt the pressure on her face lessen. A breath of fresh air, though laden with earth, reached her cracked lips, and then, through the darkness that enveloped her, she saw, not a person, not an angel, but two amber eyes, bright and intense, that gazed at her with wild curiosity and a strange compassion. A furry, powerful paw, with claws that had just saved her life, was inches from her face. The jaguar's low growl, previously a sound of effort, now seemed a warning, a promise. Nature had answered her cry, and time for an instant had stopped. The jaguar, the true guardian of that land, had arrived, and Helena's fight for life was far from over. The darkness, once absolute and oppressive, was now punctuated by two amber beacons, intense and wild. Helena, on the verge of collapse, could barely process the image. It wasn't the face of a human savior, nor the vision of an angel, but the face of a jaguar, the most fearsome predator of those lands. Fear, a primordial instinct that had accompanied her since the earth began to cover her, should have exploded into panic. But strangely it did not. There was something in those eyes, a depth that transcended simple ferocity, an almost protective curiosity. The furry paw, with claws that had torn through the earth and now brushed her face, was a lethal weapon, but the sensation was not one of threat. It was one of salvation. The air entering through the crack, though laden with earth and the animal's strong, wild scent, was the sweetest she had ever breathed. It was life. It was the promise of one more breath, one more instant away from eternal darkness. The jaguar, with a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the coffin wood, retreated slightly, but its eyes never left Helena's. It was as if it were assessing, understanding the fragility of the creature it had just unearthed. With a precise movement, the beast began to dig again, but now with a new objective. No longer to find, but to free. Its claws, previously furious, now worked with surprising delicacy, widening the crack, removing the earth that still held the coffin lid. Each clod of earth that fell, each scrape of claw on the wood, was a sound of hope for Helena. Her lungs, previously burning, now received gusts of fresh air, and consciousness, which threatened to abandon her, began to solidify. The pain in her chest, the pressure of the earth, everything seemed a little less unbearable. But liberation would not be easy. She was still trapped, her body weak and stiff from the forced position and terror. The jaguar, head lowered, continued its work. The crack widened, revealing more of the twilight sky, now tinged with shades of purple and orange. The faint light bathed the jaguar's face, highlighting the dark rosettes of its coat, transforming it from a creature of nightmare into an almost mystical vision, a being of raw power, but also of strange and unexpected grace. Helena tried to move her arms, but the space was minimal. The coffin, her makeshift grave, was also her prison. She heard the wood creak under the force of the jaguar's claws, felt the vibration of the animal working above her. The smell of damp earth mingled with the jaguar's musky odor, creating an olfactory symphony of savagery and survival. Suddenly, with a dry crack, the wood above her head gave way a little more. The jaguar had managed to tear off a piece of the lid, creating a larger opening, an irregular hole that now allowed more air and light to enter. The pressure on her face decreased considerably, and Helena managed, with monumental effort, to turn her head slightly. She could see the sky, the first stars beginning to dot the dark expanse. The jaguar stopped, raising its head, its amber eyes fixed again on Helena's, as if expecting a response, a sign. The low growl returned, but this time it seemed more like encouragement than a warning. It was a call to action, a silent urgency. Helena, with a dry mouth and a scratched throat, tried to speak, but only a hoarse wheeze escaped. She gathered the last shred of her strength. Her trembling arms rose with difficulty, fumbling at the rough wood of the coffin. She tried to push the lid, but the weight of the surrounding earth was still immense. The hole made by the jaguar was a window, not a door. The jaguar, as if understanding the difficulty, acted again. With its paw, it pushed more earth away from the side of the coffin, exposing a little more of the wood. Then, with surprising force, it dug its claws into the edge of the opening and pulled. The wood creaked, cracked, and a larger piece of the lid came loose, falling to the side with a muffled thud. Now, there was enough space for Helena to truly breathe, for her shoulders to move. The cold night air, laden with the scent of the forest, filled her aching lungs. She coughed, choked, but it was a cough of life, not death. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she could see the jaguar more clearly, inches away, observing her with an intensity that was almost palpable. The beast showed no signs of aggression, only watchful vigilance. It was as if it were waiting for Helena to do her part. The jaguar had opened the way, but the journey out of the grave was still hers. With a groan of effort, Helena tried to push herself up, but her muscles were atrophied, her body a mass of pain and exhaustion. She felt the cold, damp earth in her hands, the rough wood of the coffin against her back. The jaguar, with a smooth and powerful movement, placed one of its front paws on the edge of the coffin, right beside Helena's head. It was not an attack, but a point of support, a presence. Its amber eyes, now closer, seemed to encourage her. Nature, in its wildest and most unpredictable form, had become her only ally. Helena's fight for life, which seemed to have ended, now gained a new and unexpected chapter with a guardian of rosettes and sharp claws. Time, for now, had been generous, but the night was still young, and the farm, a place of secrets and dangers. The jaguar's paw, soft and powerful, rested on the edge of the coffin, an unexpected point of support in her private hell. There was no human warmth, no promise of a saving embrace, only the wild presence of a creature that, for some unfathomable reason, had chosen to unearth her. The jaguar's amber eyes, fixed on hers, seemed a mirror of nature itself, relentless, yet strangely just. Helena felt a shiver run down her spine, not of paralyzing fear, but of a deep and terrifying understanding. Life, in its rawest form, was there, offering a second chance. With a hoarse groan that barely scratched her dry throat, Helena tried to push herself up. Her arms, once strong and capable, were now dry branches, trembling and powerless. Her muscles protested, atrophied by forced inactivity and the terror that had consumed her. Pain radiated from every joint, every fiber of her being. But the urgency to get out of that makeshift grave was greater than any physical agony. She fumbled at the rough wood of the coffin, seeking a point of support, anything that could help her rise. The damp, cold earth clung to her hands, and the smell of decomposition mingled with the jaguar's musky aroma, a bizarre combination of death and wildlife. The jaguar, as if understanding Helena's weakness, let out a low, guttural growl. It was not a sound of threat, but of impatience, perhaps encouragement. With a fluid movement, it withdrew its paw, but instead of moving away, it began to dig again, no longer at the lid, but at the sides of the coffin, dislodging the earth that still held it. Each paw strike, each claw scrape, was a sound of approaching freedom. The coffin wood groaned under the pressure, and more earth collapsed, revealing a little more of the wooden structure. The jaguar was, indeed, freeing her. Helena, eagerly inhaling the fresh air, felt a wave of dizziness. The prolonged lack of oxygen was taking its toll, but the sight of the starry sky, now wider through the opening, was a balm for her tormented soul. She forced her knees to bend, her hips to move, an inch at a time. The space was tight, the coffin a wooden straitjacket. She felt the cold, damp earth on her back, the weight of the world still upon her, even as the jaguar worked to relieve it. With a Herculean effort, Helena managed to turn her body sideways, leaning on her elbow. The pain was excruciating, but the sight of the jaguar, now with its head lowered, concentrated on its work, was a strange focus for her mind. The beast's muscles contracted and relaxed under its spotted skin, a perfect survival machine. It wasn't there out of compassion, Helena knew. It was there because it sensed life, imbalance, the violation of natural order. It was an instrument of nature, and Helena, by a whim of fate, was the beneficiary. Suddenly, with a dry crack and a creak of wood, the jaguar managed to tear off a larger piece from the side of the coffin. The opening widened considerably, and Helena felt the weight of the earth diminish even more. Now, she could stretch an arm, fumbling at the cold, damp soil outside the coffin. Freedom was inches away, but it seemed an insurmountable abyss. Her body trembled uncontrollably, not only from the night's cold, but from exhaustion and trauma. The jaguar, with a final powerful push, opened a hole large enough for Helena to, with great effort, try to crawl out. The beast stepped back, its amber eyes fixed on Helena as if to say, "The rest is up to you." The low growl, now softer, seemed a final encouragement. Helena, with scratched skin and covered in dirt, dragged herself out of the coffin, one limb at a time. Every movement was a battle against pain and weakness. The cold night air hit her, a thermal shock that made her gasp. She was free. Free from the darkness, from confinement, from imminent death. But freedom came at a price. She was in the middle of nowhere, in the darkness of the farm, with a jaguar a few feet away. Her eyes, still adjusting to the dim light, swept the scene. The grave, now an irregular hole in the earth, was a vivid reminder of her near death. The partially destroyed coffin seemed like a monster that had just vomited its victim, and the jaguar, majestic and silent, watched her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. Vulnerable, Helena tried to stand, but her legs gave way. She fell to her knees on the cold earth, tears streaming down her dirty face. They were tears of relief, of terror, of gratitude, of everything. She was alive. But now what? Where to go? Sophia, her tormentor, would be sleeping peacefully in the main house, convinced that her plan had succeeded. The idea of confronting her, of seeking revenge, seemed a distant dream, unattainable in her current state. The jaguar took a step closer, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. Helena froze, the survival instinct screaming in her brain. But the jaguar did not attack. Instead, it sniffed the air, then turned and began to move away slowly, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. There was no goodbye, no acknowledgement. The jaguar had done its part, and now nature called it back. Helena remained there, kneeling, watching the darkness swallow her savior. The silence of the night was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breath. She was alone, completely alone, in the middle of nowhere, wounded, weak, and certain that her life was in constant danger. The jaguar had freed her from the earth, but now she was free to face the dangers of the surface, and the greatest of them was yet to come. The night was long, and Helena's journey was just beginning. She needed a plan, strength, a miracle, and above all, she needed to survive. The night air, once a breath of life, was now an icy embrace that penetrated Helena's bones. She was free, but freedom tasted bitter with despair. Her body, a mass of pain and exhaustion, refused to obey. Every muscle protested, every joint screamed. She was on her knees on the cold earth, tears streaming down her dirty face, mixing with dust and sweat. They were not just tears of relief, but of a profound terror that still gripped her, a visceral fear that reminded her of life's fragility. The jaguar had left. Its powerful silhouette dissolved into the darkness of the forest, taking with it the strange and wild protection it had offered. Helena was alone, completely alone. The silence of the farm, previously broken by the frantic sounds of digging, was now oppressive, punctuated only by the distant rustle of leaves and the hum of nocturnal insects. She raised her head, her blurred eyes sweeping the darkness. The sky, a black cloak sprinkled with indifferent stars, seemed vast and merciless. Where to go? The question echoed in her mind, a dull throb against her skull. The main house with its distant lights was a beacon of danger, a viper's nest where Sophia, her tormentor, slept peacefully, convinced that her macabre plan had succeeded. Going there would be signing her own death warrant, but staying there by the open grave was equally unsustainable. The smell of disturbed earth, the partially destroyed coffin, were vivid reminders of her near death, a monument to Sophia's cruelty. Helena tried to stand again. Her trembling arms supported her on the damp earth. Her legs, like bamboo stalks, gave way under her body's weight. She fell back, a hoarse groan escaping her throat. The weakness was overwhelming. Her body, accustomed to comfort and luxury, was now a burden, a prison of pain. But her mind, that was sharp, driven by a growing rage, a burning desire for justice. Sophia could not get away with it. Helena could not allow it. With superhuman effort, she crawled away from the grave, using her elbows and knees. Every movement was an agony, but the image of Sophia's face, smiling victoriously, was a whip to her soul. She needed to get away, find shelter, regain a minimum of strength. The night's cold began to numb her limbs, and dehydration made her head throb. The farm was a labyrinth of shadows, twisted trees, fences invisible in the darkness, the indistinct outline of old sheds and barns. Every shadow seemed to harbor danger, every distant noise a threat. The jaguar, though her savior, was a constant reminder of the wild nature that surrounded her. Were there other predators in the night? Or was the greatest predator still human? She dragged herself through the undergrowth, feeling branches and stones scratch her exposed skin. Her dress, once elegant, was now a dirty, torn rag. Her hair, tangled and full of earth. She was an apparition, a ghost who had returned from the world of the dead. And in a way, that's exactly what she was. A searing thirst tormented her. Her throat was dry, scratchy, as if she had swallowed sand. Water. She needed water and warmth, and a safe place away from Sophia's eyes. The main house, with its inviting yellow lights, flickered in the distance, a treacherous mirage. She knew she couldn't approach it. Her eyes, still adjusting to the dim light, tried to discern something on the horizon. Perhaps a stream, a spring, anything. But the darkness was dense, and the farm vast. She remembered the days when she used to walk those lands with her late husband, the familiar paths, the known trails. Now, everything seemed strange, hostile. Suddenly a sound, a distant bark, a dog. Helena's heart pounded. It was a sign of life, perhaps a sign of danger. The farm dogs, if alerted, could lead Sophia directly to her. She froze, shrinking further into the vegetation, trying to merge with the shadows. The bark did not repeat, only the oppressive silence reigned again. She needed a plan. She couldn't just wander aimlessly. With each step, each drag, her strength waned. The adrenaline that had propelled her out of the grave began to dissipate, leaving behind only pain and exhaustion. The idea of hiding in one of the old barns or sheds on the farm began to take shape in her mind. They were old structures, often abandoned, but they could offer some shelter, some protection against the cold and curious eyes. With a renewed breath of determination, Helena forced herself to continue. Vengeance, Justice, the simple need to survive, were the engines that propelled her. Sophia had tried to kill her, but nature, in its wild wisdom, had given her a second chance, and Helena would not waste it. She took a deep breath, the icy air burning her lungs. The night was long, and the journey uncertain, but one thing was clear: Helena was alive, and Sophia would pay for it. The hunt had only just begun, and this time the prey knew who the predator was. The smell of old hay and damp wood began to intensify, guiding Helena through the darkness. Her eyes, now more adapted, distinguished the massive silhouette of an old barn, a sleeping giant in the landscape. The wooden walls, grey and weathered by time, seemed to promise refuge, however precarious. Every inch she crawled was a victory over exhaustion. Her arms, scratched and dirty, pulled her heavy body, her legs dragging lifelessly. The cold continued to bite, but the proximity of shelter instilled a new, albeit faint, hope. She reached the base of the barn. The door, splintered and ajar, offered a dark crack, a silent invitation to the interior. With a last effort, Helena pushed the heavy wood. A sharp creak echoed in the night, making her freeze. She waited, her heart beating wildly, but no other sound followed. The world seemed to sleep, oblivious to her struggle. She squeezed through the opening, falling face down on the dirt floor. The air inside the barn was heavy, dusty, but slightly less cold than outside. The smell of hay was strong, almost suffocating, but it was a smell of life, of shelter. In the dim light, she could distinguish piles of hay, rusty tools, and the outline of old farm equipment. It wasn't the luxury she was used to, but it was a roof over her head, a place to hide. She dragged herself to one of the hay piles, sinking her aching body into the rough softness. The hay scratched her skin, but the warmth it offered was a welcome balm. She curled up, trying to cover herself as much as possible, feeling her body tremble uncontrollably. The adrenaline that had propelled her there finally dissipated, leaving her at the mercy of pain and exhaustion. Her eyes closed, but sleep would not come. Helena's mind was in a whirl. She was alive, yes, but her situation was desperate. Wounded, weak, without food or water, and with Sophia lurking. Revenge seemed a distant luxury, but the need to survive was immediate and brutal. She needed a plan, strength, a miracle, and above all, she needed to survive. The night was long, and Helena's journey, now within the cold walls of an abandoned barn, was just beginning. The smell of old hay and damp wood was now her refuge, a rough, dusty embrace that for a moment promised relief. Helena was inside the barn, stretched out on a pile of hay, her body trembling uncontrollably. It wasn't just the cold that made her shiver, but the aftermath of terror, the exhaustion that weighed more than any physical pain. Every muscle protested, every joint screamed. The air was heavy, saturated with the odor of rural life and decay, but it was air, and she was breathing. In the almost total darkness, her eyes, still adjusting, distinguished the ghostly silhouettes of rusty tools and abandoned farm equipment. Spiderwebs hung like mourning veils, and dust covered everything, a thick layer of oblivion. It was a place of abandonment, of things left behind, and now she was one of them. Helena's mind, previously a whirlwind of panic and adrenaline, began to clear, but this clarity brought with it the rawness of her reality. She was alive, yes, a wild miracle wrought by an even wilder creature, but at what cost? Her body was a ruin. Her dress, once a symbol of her position, was now a filthy, torn rag, clinging to her skin with dirt and dried sweat. There were deep scratches on her arms and legs, marks of the struggle against the earth and vegetation. Her throat was dry, scratchy, begging for water. Hunger was a constant pang in her empty stomach. She tried to move an arm, but the pain made her groan. Her shoulder throbbed, and there was a dull ache in her rib, perhaps a fracture. The impact of the fall into the grave, the pressure of the earth, all had taken their toll. She was wounded, vulnerable, and completely alone. The luxury of her previous life seemed a distant dream, a memory of someone else. Soft beds, warm baths, abundant food, all this was now a cruel contrast to the reality of the rough hay and the cold that still penetrated her. Sophia had taken everything from her, not just the inheritance, but her dignity, her security, her very life. A wave of rage, cold and sharp as the night air began to form within her, overcoming fear and pain. Sophia. The name echoed in her mind, a sweet poison. Sophia, who had smiled as she buried her alive. Sophia, who now slept peacefully in the main house, convinced of her victory. This rage was a fire, small at first but growing, warming her from the inside out. It was no longer just the need to survive that propelled her now. It was the thirst for justice. She closed her eyes, trying to organize her thoughts. The first step was immediate survival, water. She desperately needed water. Was there a well on the farm? A stream? Memories of her walks with her husband returned, fragmented by pain and shock. There was a small stream that ran near the edge of the forest, a few hundred yards from the barn. It was a gamble, but it was the only one she had. But how to get there? Every movement was torture. She needed to rest, regain a minimum of strength. Sleep, however, was a luxury denied by fear and pain. Her ears were sharp, attentive to any sound coming from outside. The distant bark she had heard before did not repeat, but the image of the farm dogs sniffing her trail was a constant specter. And Sophia. Sophia might wake up, have a premonition, or simply send someone to check the grave. The idea of being found there, weak and defenseless, was a renewed terror. Helena curled up further into the hay, pulling the dry stalks to cover her body. The smell of mold and dust was suffocating, but she endured it. It was a hiding place for now. She needed a plan, not just to survive, but to rise again. Sophia had underestimated the strength of her will, the depth of her love for her husband, and the life he had built. Sophia had underestimated the wild nature that, ironically, had saved her. She was an apparition, a ghost who had returned from the world of the dead, and Sophia would pay for it. The hunt had only just begun, and this time the prey knew who the predator was. Helena was alive, and that was the most dangerous truth Sophia would ever face. The night was long, and Helena's journey, now within the cold walls of an abandoned barn, was just beginning. But she was no longer just fleeing, she was preparing. Her body was a ruin. Her dress, once a symbol of her position, was now a filthy, torn rag, clinging to her skin with dirt and dried sweat. There were deep scratches on her arms and legs, marks of the struggle against the earth and vegetation. Her throat was dry, scratchy, begging for water. Hunger was a constant pang in her empty stomach. She tried to move an arm, but the pain made her groan. Her shoulder throbbed, and there was a dull ache in her rib, perhaps a fracture. The impact of the fall into the grave, the pressure of the earth, all had taken their toll. She was wounded, vulnerable, and completely alone. Pain pulsed in her shoulder, a constant reminder of the brutality she had suffered. Every breath was an effort, every heartbeat a dull drum in her ears. But behind the physical pain, a chilling clarity began to settle in. Sophia had not killed her. The earth, which should have been her tomb, had become her cradle. The jaguar, a wild predator, had been her guardian angel. The universe, in some way, had conspired to give her a second chance, and Helena would not waste it. She opened her eyes in the darkness, allowing rage to consume her, transforming weakness into an iron determination. There was no more room for paralyzing fear. There was only the need to survive and the promise of retribution. She needed water, yes, but she also needed a plan that went beyond mere subsistence. A plan to make Sophia pay for every second of terror, for every grain of earth that suffocated her, for every beat of her heart that almost stopped. The barn was a labyrinth of shadows and smells. The hay, though it offered warmth, was also a reminder of her vulnerability. She was hidden but not safe. At any moment, one of the farmhands might come for a tool, or an animal might seek shelter there. She needed something more, something to defend herself perhaps. Her eyes swept the interior, searching for an object, anything that could serve as a weapon or tool. There was a rusty rake leaning against the wall, its sharp tines covered in dust. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. With a muffled groan, Helena tried to drag herself closer. The pain in her shoulder and rib was excruciating. But the image of Sophia's smile, as the earth fell upon her, was a more potent analgesic than any medicine. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the cold, rough metal. Her strength was minimal, but her will was immense. She managed to pull the rake closer, the sound scratching the night's silence. She held it with difficulty, feeling the weight and texture of the wooden handle. It wasn't a sword, but in her hands at that moment it felt like an extension of her own fury. It was a symbol of her refusal to be a victim again. With the rake beside her, Helena felt a little more protected, a little less defenseless. But thirst still tormented her, a constant torture. The stream. She needed to reach the stream before dawn, before the sunlight revealed her presence. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was dehydration, a slow and agonizing death, and she would not allow Sophia that victory. She closed her eyes again, visualizing the path. The barn was on the property's edge, near the forest. The stream ran further into the forest, but not too far. Darkness was her ally, but also her enemy, hiding traps and dangers. She would have to move slowly, cautiously, using the rake as support and, if necessary, as defense. The night was still young, but time was a luxury she did not possess. With each passing minute, Sophia gained more time to consolidate her charade, to revel in her supposed victory. Helena could not allow it. She was a ghost, yes, but a ghost with a mission, and that mission would begin with a sip of water and end with Sophia's ruin. The hunt had transformed into a war, and Helena was ready to fight. She made an effort to sit up, leaning on the hay. Her body protested, but she ignored it. The pain was a reminder that she was alive, and that was all that mattered. The moon, a thin, silvery slice, began to peek through a crack in the barn roof, casting a pale beam of light onto the floor. It was a sign, perhaps, that the night would not last forever, and with dawn would come the need to act. The stream. That was her destination, and Sophia, her judgment. The moon, a silvery, indifferent slice, peered through a crack in the barn roof, casting a pale beam onto the dusty floor. It was a cruel reminder that the night would not last forever, and with dawn would come the need to act. The stream. That was her immediate destination, and Sophia, her judgment. Helena made a superhuman effort to sit up, leaning on the rough hay. Her body protested with a chorus of sharp pains, but she ignored them. The pain was a reminder that she was alive, and that in itself was a victory. The rage, once a small fire, now burned with a cold intensity, consuming fear and exhaustion. She was no longer the fragile, defenseless Helena. She was the Helena who had returned from the grave. With the rusty rake serving as support, she began to drag herself. Every movement was torture. Her shoulder throbbed, her rib ached with every deep breath, and the scratches on her legs and arms burned as if they had been made with embers. Her dress, once a symbol of her comfortable life, was now a burden, heavy with dirt and dampness, torn in several places. But she did not stop. The image of Sophia's smiling face as the earth fell upon her was a more potent analgesic than any medicine. The barn door, a heavy, creaking wooden structure, seemed like a gateway to another world. With the rake, she managed to push it open, creating a tiny crack. The cold night air invaded the barn, bringing with it the damp smell of earth and the distant aroma of manure. The sound of the wood creaking echoed in the silence, and Helena stopped, her heart beating wildly, attentive to any response. No dog bark, no sound of footsteps. The farm slept. With the caution of a wounded animal, she crawled out, using the rake as an extension of her body, testing the ground before each movement. The grass under her fingers was damp with dew, and the night's cold penetrated her torn clothes, but she barely felt it. Her mind was focused on a single objective: water. Darkness was her ally, but also her enemy, hiding traps and dangers. She would have to move slowly, cautiously, using the rake as support and, if necessary, as defense. The barn was on the property's edge, near the forest. The stream ran further into the forest, but not too far. Every step was a battle. The uneven terrain of the farm, with its small elevations and depressions, was a challenge for her exhausted body. Dry branches cracked under her feet, and she flinched at every sound, fearing that the farm dogs, or worse, Sophia, would be alerted. Shadows danced around her, transforming bushes into menacing figures, and the night breeze whispered secrets in her ears, increasing her paranoia. She stumbled on an exposed root, falling to her knees with a muffled groan. The pain in her shoulder intensified, but she refused to give in. She rose again, her breath ragged, her muscles trembling. Thirst was a constant torture, her throat scratchy and dry, begging for a relief that seemed infinitely distant. The forest, a dark and impenetrable mass, finally rose before her. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves was stronger here, and the sound of nocturnal insects seemed amplified. She hesitated for a moment. Entering the forest was entering unknown territory, a place where dangers could be even greater. But the water was there. With renewed determination, Helena pushed her way through the first bushes, using the rake to clear away branches and spiderwebs. The darkness was almost total beneath the tree canopy, and she had to rely on her other senses. The distant sound of running water, faint at first, began to grow clearer, a beacon of hope amidst despair. Her feet sank into the soft, damp earth, and she felt the undergrowth brush against her legs. With each step, the promise of water propelled her. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the forest opened up a little, revealing a small stream winding between the rocks. The water, dark and shimmering under the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, murmured a welcoming song. Helena collapsed on the bank, the rake falling beside her with a dull thud. She crawled to the edge, her trembling hands plunging into the cold water. The icy contact was a shock, but also immediate relief. She brought the water to her lips, drinking in large gulps, feeling it slide down her dry throat, washing away the dust and terror. It was the most delicious water she had ever tasted, an elixir that brought life back to her cracked lips and clouded mind. She drank until her thirst was quenched, until her stomach was full, and her body, for a brief moment, felt less in ruins. The water was more than just a liquid. It was a promise, a baptism. She had been reborn. With her thirst quenched, clarity returned with full force. Sophia had tried to kill her, had buried her alive, had stolen her life. But Helena was here, alive, breathing, and stronger than ever. The rage that propelled her now was no longer a small fire, but an uncontrollable blaze, burning with the force of an ancestral fury. She sat on the stream bank, her body still aching, but her mind sharp. The rake lay beside her, a reminder of her new reality. She was no longer the rich, protected woman. She was a survivor, a warrior, and Sophia, her enemy, would pay, not just for the inheritance, but for every second of terror, for every grain of earth that suffocated her, for every beat of her heart that almost stopped. The night was still long, but time was a luxury she did not possess. With each passing minute, Sophia gained more time to consolidate her charade, to revel in her supposed victory. Helena could not allow it. She was a ghost, yes, but a ghost with a mission. And that mission would begin with survival, but end with Sophia's ruin. The hunt had transformed into a war, and Helena was ready to fight. The stream's cold, clear water not only quenched Helena's thirst, it washed the dust of death from her soul. Each sip was a rebirth, a baptism in fury. The fragile woman, buried alive by Sophia's cruelty, had died in that hole. The one who emerged was another, forged in earth and darkness, with a purpose as sharp as a knife blade. Pain still tore at her body, a constant reminder of the brutality she had suffered, but now it was a pain that propelled her, not paralyzed her. It was fuel for vengeance. She sat on the damp bank, the rusty rake resting beside her like a faithful companion. Her mind, previously clouded by dehydration and terror, now operated with terrifying clarity. Sophia. The name echoed in her head, not as a lament, but as a war cry. The inheritance, the money, all that was secondary now. What mattered was justice. It was making Sophia pay for every second of dread, for every beat of her heart that almost ceased beneath the earth. Time was her most relentless enemy. The moon, already waning, announced the approaching dawn. With the sunlight would come the risk of being discovered, of having her escape thwarted before it even began. She needed a plan, and she needed it now. She couldn't simply go to the main house. Sophia would be there, perhaps already weaving her web of lies, setting the stage for her morning charade. Helena needed an advantage, irrefutable proof, or a way to corner her stepdaughter without giving her a chance to escape. Her eyes swept the dark forest. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves was strong, mixed with something wilder, more primal. A shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't just the cold of the night, it was the sensation of being watched, of not being alone in that vast and dangerous territory. For an instant, a fleeting image passed through her mind. The sound of something scratching the earth above her, a brute force working. Was it an animal? A delirium of a mind on the verge of collapse? She didn't know, but the sensation of a powerful and wild presence, which had somehow touched her, persisted. The forest held secrets, and perhaps one of them was the key to her survival. The barn, where she had found the rake, was a starting point. From there she could move more discreetly, perhaps approach the house unseen. But first, she needed a safer hiding place, somewhere she could spend the rest of the night and the next day, observing, planning. The farm was large, with many nooks and abandoned structures. There was an old tool shed further away, almost swallowed by vegetation. No one had been there for years. It would be perfect. With the rake serving as support, Helena stood up. Every muscle protested, but she silenced them with the force of her will. The pain was a reminder that she was alive, and that was all that mattered. She was no longer the defenseless Helena, the woman Sophia thought she had dispatched forever. She was a force of nature, reborn from the grave, and Sophia would feel the weight of her resurrection. She began to move again, away from the stream, deeper into the forest, but in a direction that would lead her back to the property's boundaries. Branches cracked under her feet, but she moved with an instinctive caution, like a wounded animal seeking refuge. Darkness was her ally, but also a veil that hid dangers. She used the rake to probe the ground ahead, clearing away spiderwebs and low branches. The distant sound of a coyote howling tore through the night's silence, and Helena stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't a coyote, it was something larger, deeper, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the forest, a reminder of the wild nature that surrounded her. That guttural, powerful sound seemed to echo the same force she had felt when being unearthed. The jaguar, the predatory queen of those lands, the same one that perhaps had sensed her life beneath the earth and, by an inexplicable instinct, had helped her out. The idea was absurd, but the sensation of a primal connection persisted. She could not afford to be afraid. Fear was a luxury Sophia had stolen from her. Now there was only determination. The tool shed. That was her next objective. From there she would observe the house, Sophia's movements, and wait for the right moment. She needed information, a vantage point. Sophia had underestimated her capacity to survive. She had underestimated the force of life that pulsed within her, and above all, she had underestimated the fury of a woman who refused to be a victim. The terrain began to become more familiar, indicating that she was approaching the edge of the forest and the older structures of the farm. The smell of old wood and rusty metal began to replace the damp aroma of the forest. She spotted the silhouette of the shed, a decrepit, leaning structure, almost swallowed by vines. It was perfect, hidden, forgotten, and far enough from the house to be safe, but close enough to observe. With a final effort, she crawled to the half-open door of the shed, pushing it with her shoulder. The creak was muffled by the night breeze. The interior was dark and dusty, full of old tools and spider webs. But it was a shelter. It was a place where she could rest, think, and plan Sophia's ruin. The night was still long, but dawn would bring not the end, but the beginning of her war. And Helena was ready to fight. The creak of the tool shed door, muffled by the night breeze, was the sound of a portal opening to a new hell, or perhaps to a new kind of salvation. Helena pushed the rotten wood with her shoulder, the smell of mold, rust, and dry earth invading her nostrils. The darkness inside was almost absolute, broken only by faint slivers of moonlight filtering through cracks in the walls and roof. She entered, the rake still in her hand, and the door creaked again as it closed behind her, sealing her in what would be her temporary sanctuary. The floor was covered with a thick layer of dust and spider webs. Old tools, forgotten by time, hung from the walls or lay in disordered piles. Rusty shovels, hammers with broken handles, dull saws. A workbench covered in debris occupied one corner, and bags of petrified fertilizer were heaped in another. It was not a comfortable place, but it was a shelter. It was dry, hidden, and, most importantly, away from Sophia's eyes. Helena fumbled in the dark, using the rake to clear away spiderwebs that clung to her face and hair. She found a corner between some old sacks and a pile of stacked wood that seemed a little less dirty. With a groan of pain, she let herself fall to the ground, her body protesting with every movement. Exhaustion was an overwhelming weight, but adrenaline still coursed through her veins, keeping her alert. The silence of the shed was almost as oppressive as the darkness. Only the distant sound of crickets and the rustle of leaves outside broke the quiet. She closed her eyes for an instant, trying to organize her thoughts, but images of the earth suffocating her, despair and fury mingled in her mind. She opened her eyes again, seeking clarity. The first task was the most basic: survive the night. The pre-dawn cold began to intensify, and her torn, dirty clothes offered little protection. She searched for something to cover herself with. Her eyes had adjusted somewhat to the dim light, and she spotted an old canvas blanket rolled up in a corner. It was dirty and dusty, but it was better than nothing. She pulled it to herself, wrapping it around her, and the smell of mold and dampness enveloped her, but also brought a rudimentary warmth. With her body a little warmer, her mind began to work more efficiently. Sophia. The name was poison, a promise. She needed a plan. She couldn't just show up at the main house, dirty, torn, with a rake in her hand, and expect anyone to believe her story. Sophia would have time to invent a narrative, to present herself as the grieving daughter, to solidify her lie. Helena needed proof. She needed a way to expose Sophia without giving her a chance to turn the tables. Her eyes swept the cracks in the wall, seeking a view of the main house. The distance was considerable, but she could distinguish the imposing silhouette of the mansion against the sky that was beginning to lighten on the eastern horizon. Soon the sun would rise, and with it, Sophia's charade would begin. Helena felt a pang of urgency. She needed information. How did Sophia plan to announce her death? Whom would she contact? Where would the will be? The farm was large, but the house was the center of everything. She needed to get closer, observe, listen, but not now, not in the darkness, where the dangers of the forest still lurked, and where her appearance would make her a ghostly figure, more likely to be mistaken for a delusion than for the truth. The image of the jaguar, the guttural sound she had heard, the frantic scratching in the earth above her, returned to her mind. It was a vivid, almost palpable memory. Could it have been a wild animal, driven by curiosity or instinct, that had unearthed her? The idea was strange, almost mystical, but the sensation of a powerful and protective presence, though wild, persisted. Nature, which had almost swallowed her, had also freed her. It was a cruel irony, but also a source of strength. Helena could not afford to be afraid. Fear was a luxury Sophia had stolen from her. Now there was only determination. She was a force of nature, reborn from the grave, and Sophia would feel the weight of her resurrection. Dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of grey and pink. The faint light began to penetrate further into the shed, revealing dust dancing in the air and the outlines of rusty tools. Helena knew she couldn't stay there forever. She needed a plan of action for the day. First, she would need something to eat and drink. The stream had saved her, but hunger was beginning to gnaw at her stomach. There was an old well near the farmhand's house, but going there would be risky. Perhaps there was a bucket of rainwater somewhere, or wild berries in the forest. Second, she needed a way to communicate, to call for help, but without alerting Sophia. The main house's landline was the only option, but it was impossible to access it unseen, and her own cell phone, if it still existed, would be buried with what Sophia thought was her body. Third, and most crucially, she needed irrefutable proof of Sophia's guilt, something the police couldn't ignore, something that would expose the charade. Where would Sophia have kept the fake will? Or perhaps, where would she have hidden the shovel she used to bury her? The rake in her hand was a symbol of her escape, but not proof of a crime. Helena looked at the rake, its rough wooden handle and rusty tines. It was a rudimentary weapon, but it was all she had. She was no longer the rich, protected woman. She was a survivor, a warrior, and Sophia, her enemy, would pay. Not just for the inheritance, but for every second of terror, for every grain of earth that suffocated her, for every beat of her heart that almost stopped. The sun began to peak above the trees, casting long shadows. The day had arrived. And with it, Helena's war against Sophia. She stood up, her body still aching but her mind sharp. It was time to observe. It was time to plan. It was time to hunt. The sun, now an orange-red sphere on the horizon, cast golden rays through the shed's cracks, painting the air with dancing dust particles. Helena watched the main house, its imposing silhouette once representing safety and comfort, now a bastion of betrayal. Her eyes, swollen and red, swept every window, every door, searching for the slightest sign of movement. Sophia's mind, she knew, would be teeming with the next steps of her charade. The smell of mold and damp earth was a constant reminder of her new reality. The canvas blanket, rough and dirty, offered little solace against the cold that still persisted in the morning. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, a symphony of pain that reminded her of the violence she had suffered. Her throat was dry, her mouth with a bitter taste of earth and despair. Hunger, once a distant annoyance, now became a searing pain in her stomach. But physical pain was a small price to pay for life and for the vengeance she had sworn. Suddenly, the kitchen door of the main house opened. Sophia. Helena squinted, her heart pounding against her ribs. Sophia was dressed in black, a subtle veil covering part of her face, a perfect image of mourning. Helena felt a wave of nausea. The hypocrisy was so palpable it was suffocating. Sophia carried a tray, which she placed on the back porch, and then sat down, picking up a cell phone. Helena observed every movement, every gesture. Sophia spoke on the phone, her voice low, but the tone of her posture indicated a serious conversation. Was she calling the lawyer, the police, to announce the tragedy? Helena's fury grew, an intense heat spreading through her veins, overcoming the cold and pain. Sophia was staging her mourning, solidifying her lie, while Helena, the supposed dead woman, watched her from the shadows, a ghost of flesh and blood. The need for water and food became urgent. There was no way to plan or act with her body so debilitated. Helena scanned the shed with her eyes, looking for something, anything. Rusty tools, bags of fertilizer, piles of rotten wood, nothing edible. But in a corner, almost hidden under a tarp, she spotted a metal bucket. With an effort, she dragged it out. It was empty. Frustration hit her, but she refused to give in. The old well near the farmhand's house was the only known water source, but it was too risky. The farmhands could be awake at any moment. Helena needed an alternative. Her eyes returned to the dense forest surrounding the farm. Wild berries. A smaller stream, perhaps. The jaguar, the image of the feline, its brute strength and instinct returned to her mind. The nature that had almost consumed her had also freed her. She needed to embrace that savagery to survive. Sophia ended the call, wiped an imaginary tear from her face, and stood up, returning inside the house. The kitchen door closed again, sealing the stage of the charade. Helena knew she had a window of time. The farmhand's house was still silent. It was her chance. With the rake in hand, Helena crawled out of the shed, moving with the caution of a predator. The sun was already higher, and the light revealed the extent of her injuries. Deep scratches, purple bruises, and dry earth still clinging to her hair and clothes. She looked like a creature emerged from a nightmare, and in a way, that's exactly what she was. She crept along the edge of the forest, using the vegetation as cover. The smell of dew and damp earth was invigorating. Her eyes scanned the ground for something edible. Small red berries, leaves of some plant she didn't recognize. The instinct of survival was her only guide. She found some wild blackberries, still green, but with an acidic taste that awakened her taste buds. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Thirst was the biggest problem. She needed clean water. The stream that had saved her was too far for a quick foray. She remembered a rain gutter that ran down the roof of the tractor shed, a little further on. Perhaps there was a collection barrel. It was a risk, but a calculated one. As she moved, a distant sound caught her attention, a howl. Not the coyote howl she had heard before, but something deeper, more powerful. The jaguar, the feline's presence, invisible but palpable, was a constant reminder of the wild nature that surrounded her. It was a sound that sent a shiver down her spine, but also a strange sense of companionship. The jaguar was the queen of those lands, and Helena now felt part of that untamed kingdom. She reached the tractor shed. It was larger than the tool shed, with a rusty sliding door. The gutter was there, and below it a green plastic barrel, half full of rainwater. The sight was an oasis. Helena approached cautiously, making sure no one was watching her. The water was dirty, with leaves and insects, but it was water. She drank it in large gulps, feeling life slowly return to her body. Every drop was an elixir, a promise of renewed strength. With her thirst quenched and a little food in her stomach, Helena's mind began to function clearly again. She needed more than just to survive. She needed proof. Sophia would not be caught by her word. She would need something concrete, something irrefutable. Where would Sophia have hidden the fake will or the shovel she used to bury her? The shovel, the tool of the crime. If Helena could find it, dirty with earth, perhaps even with traces of her own blood, it would be powerful evidence. The tool shed was a good place to start looking. Sophia wouldn't be careless enough to leave it in plain sight, but she also wouldn't take it too far away. Helena looked at the rake in her hand. It was a rudimentary weapon, but it was all she had. She was no longer the rich, protected woman. She was a survivor, a warrior, and Sophia, her enemy, would pay, not just for the inheritance, but for every second of terror, for every grain of earth that suffocated her, for every beat of her heart that almost stopped. The sun was already high in the sky, and the morning heat began to intensify. The day had arrived, and with it, Helena's war against Sophia. She stood up, her body still aching, but her mind sharp, her determination unshakable. It was time to hunt. It was time to find the shovel. It was time to begin unearthing the truth. Helena returned to the tool shed, her breathing more controlled, her heart beating with a new cadence, not of fear, but of purpose. The rake, once a mere instrument of escape, was now an extension of her will. Sunlight streamed through the cracks, illuminating the dusty interior, revealing spiderwebs and the strong smell of rusty metal and old wood. Every shadow seemed to hide a secret, every corner a clue. She began her search methodically, moving with the calculated slowness of an animal tracking its prey. Her eyes, once blurred with despair, were now sharpened by necessity. She scanned the walls, where tools of all kinds hung on hooks, hammers, saws, axes. No shovel. She knelt, examining the dirt floor, where piles of empty sacks and dusty boxes accumulated. With each object she touched, a cloud of dust rose, and the smell of earth, so familiar from her grave, invaded her. Helena's mind worked feverishly. Sophia was calculating, but also impulsive. Where would she hide something so incriminating? It wouldn't be in the main house, where the police might look, but it also wouldn't be too far away, as she would need to dispose of it at some point. The shed was the most logical place. She approached a darker corner, where a pile of old tarps and flat tires formed a small mountain. The air there was denser, more stifling. With the rake, she began to push aside the tarps, revealing what lay beneath. First a tire, then a rotten wooden box, and then something heavier, denser. Her heart leaped. There it was, a wooden-handled shovel, its broad blade dirty with dark earth. The same earth that had suffocated her, the same earth that was still stuck under her fingernails. Helena knelt, the pain in her knees ignored, and extended her trembling hand. She touched the cold blade and felt the texture of the damp earth. There was something else. Fine threads, almost imperceptible, of a dark fabric. The fabric of her dress, the same one she wore when she was buried. It was it, the shovel of the crime. Helena felt a wave of triumph mixed with profound nausea. The proof was there, cold and irrefutable. But how to take it? How to present it? She couldn't simply walk out of the shed with a dirt-covered shovel and go to town. Sophia was still in the main house, probably organizing her theater of mourning. She needed a plan that would take her off the farm to civilization with this proof in hand, unseen. The main house's landline was the only option, but it was an immense risk. And Sophia's cell phone, it would be with her. Helena looked at the shovel, then at the rake in her hand. She was no longer the rich, protected woman. She was a survivor, a warrior, and Sophia, her enemy, would pay, not just for the inheritance, but for every second of terror, for every grain of earth that suffocated her, for every beat of her heart that almost stopped. The distant howl of the jaguar echoed again, closer this time, a wild reminder that she was not alone in those untamed lands. It was a sound that sent a shiver down her spine, but also a strange sense of companionship. The jaguar was the queen of those lands, and Helena now felt part of that kingdom. She needed a hiding place for the shovel, a safe place where Sophia would never think to look, and then she would need a disguise, a way to move without being recognized. The farmhand's shed. There were old clothes there, perhaps a hat, something that could conceal her identity. But going there was another risk. Helena picked up the shovel, holding it carefully, as if it were a sacred artifact. The weight in her hands was the weight of justice. She hid it under some deeper tarps, ensuring it was out of sight. Now the next step, clothes, and then communication. The sun was already high in the sky, and the morning heat began to intensify. The day had arrived, and with it Helena's war against Sophia. She stood up, her body still aching, but her mind sharp, her determination unshakable. It was time to prepare. It was time to hunt. It was time to begin unearthing the truth once and for all. The weight of the shovel, even hidden, was a constant reminder of her new reality. Helena was no longer the prey, but the hunter. Adrenaline pulsed through her veins, mixing with muscle pain and exhaustion. It was a dissonant symphony, but it kept her moving. She needed a disguise, a way to erase herself, to become invisible on the very farm that was once her kingdom. The farmhand's shed was the only viable option, a risk she was willing to take. With the rake still in hand, Helena crawled out of the tool shed, her eyes sweeping the landscape for any movement. The morning sun, now stronger, cast long, distorted shadows, transforming familiar objects into menacing figures. She crept along the edge of the forest again, the smell of earth and damp leaves filling her lungs, a stark contrast to the stifling air of her grave. Every step was calculated, every dry leaf under her feet a potential alarm. The farmhand's shed was a considerable distance away, behind the main house near the old well. It was a place she rarely visited, but she knew it held a jumble of forgotten objects, old clothes, disused tools, perfect for her purpose. She moved like a shadow, using the bushes and trees as cover, her aching body protesting with every movement. But her mind focused on her objective. The farmhand's house was still silent. A window was ajar, and Helena could hear the distant sound of a rooster crowing. Her heart pounded in her chest, a private war drum. She approached the shed, an older, more weathered wooden structure than the others, with a creaking door and a small, dusty window. With a cautious push, the door gave way, revealing a dark, musty-smelling interior. Inside, the disorder was even greater than in the tool shed. Piles of old clothes were heaped in a corner, alongside dusty boots and faded straw hats. Helena began to rummage, her fingers nimble despite their stiffness. She found a pair of faded, torn men's jeans, a plaid flannel shirt, and a dirty baseball cap. It wasn't elegant, but it was perfect. She quickly undressed, feeling the fresh air on her wounded skin, and put on the new clothes. The pants were too wide, but an improvised belt made from a piece of rope solved the problem. The shirt hid the scratches and bruises, and the cap covered her tangled, dirty hair. She looked at herself in the distorted reflection of a broken window, an unrecognizable figure, a creature of the forest, ready to blend in. Thirst returned, but the water from the tractor shed barrel was still an option. The biggest problem now was communication. The main house's landline was an unthinkable risk. Sophia's cell phone surely was with her. Helena needed a plan, a means to reach the outside world undetected. She thought of the farmhands, if they were awake, if they had a cell phone. But it was too great a risk. She couldn't trust anyone, not yet. As her thoughts raced, a familiar sound cut through the morning silence, a howl. Closer this time, more intense, the jaguar. It wasn't a sound of threat, but of presence, of remembrance. Helena felt a shiver, but also a strange sense that she was not alone. The jaguar was a spirit of those lands, a reminder of the savagery that had rescued her. It was the queen, and Helena now was a subject, a part of that untamed kingdom. Helena needed to get off the farm. The nearest town was miles away, an impossible walk in her current state. She needed a vehicle. Sophia's car was in the main house's garage. Impossible. The tractors, too slow, too noisy. There was an old rusty motorcycle in the farmhand's shed, but she didn't know if it worked. And even if it did, the noise would attract attention. Helena's mind worked feverishly, searching for a solution. She remembered an old dirt road that cut through the property at its furthest edge, rarely used, leading to a small village. It was a longer route, but perhaps safer. If she could get there, perhaps she would find help, a phone, a means of transportation. But how to reach that road unseen? Suddenly, a distant sound coming from the main house caught her attention. A car engine. Sophia! Was she leaving or was someone arriving? Helena's heart pounded. She hid behind a pile of boxes, peeking through the crack in the door. A black car, a luxury sedan, was pulling out of the main house's garage. It wasn't Sophia's car. It was a hearse. A wave of nausea hit Helena. Sophia was staging her mourning, organizing the funeral of the woman she had buried alive. The audacity, the coldness, rage boiled within her, a fire that burned stronger than the pain. She needed to act, and fast. Time was running out. The hearse drove away, following the farm's main road. Sophia was not in it. She was still in the main house, probably making more calls, preparing her stage. Helena had a window of time. She needed to use it. The dirt road, the village. It was her only way. She needed to retrieve the shovel, her irrefutable proof, and then move. But how to carry the shovel unseen? She couldn't just carry it. She needed a backpack, something to conceal it. Her eyes swept the farmhand's shed again. Among the piles of junk, she spotted an old canvas backpack, dirty and dusty, but seemingly intact. It was a sign, a small ray of hope amidst the darkness. Helena picked it up, shaking off the dust, and felt a new purpose. She was no longer the rich, protected woman. She was a survivor, a warrior, and Sophia, her enemy, would pay. Not just for the inheritance, but for every second of terror, for every grain of earth that suffocated her, for every beat of her heart that almost stopped. The sun was already high in the sky, and the morning heat began to intensify. The day had arrived, and with it, Helena's war against Sophia. She stood up, her body still aching, but her mind sharp, her determination unshakable. It was time to hunt. It was time to find the shovel. It was time to begin unearthing the truth. It was time to flee. It was time to flee. Helena clutched the canvas backpack to her chest, feeling the rough fabric. The disguise was rudimentary, but effective. She was no longer the elegant, vulnerable woman, but an indistinct figure, a shadow among the farm's shadows. The morning sun, now higher, began to burn her exposed skin, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins was a more intense fire. The first step was to retrieve the shovel, the proof. She needed to return to the tool shed, the same place where she had hidden, the same place that held the instrument of her near death. Every muscle in her body protested, but the image of Sophia's cold face, the memory of the earth suffocating her, was a whip that propelled her. She crawled out of the farmhand's shed, her eyes sweeping the landscape with the precision of a predator. The main house seemed like a distant castle, a bastion of falsehood and cruelty. The hearse had already left, taking with it the initial staging of Sophia's mourning. But Sophia was still there, somewhere, preparing the next act of her macabre charade. Helena moved cautiously, using the undergrowth and trees as cover. The smell of dew and damp earth was a constant reminder of her new reality, of her connection to the savagery that had saved her. She approached the tool shed, her heart beating like a war drum in her chest. The door, which she had left ajar, was a crack to darkness and to justice. With a gentle push, she entered. The smell of oil and metal was familiar. Her eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light, and she located the pile of tarps where she had hidden the shovel. With trembling but firm hands, she removed the coverings. There it was, the shovel of the crime, dirty with earth, the same earth that had almost consumed her. The weight in her hands was the weight of vengeance, of the truth that would be unearthed. She fitted it into the canvas backpack, feeling the cold tip of the metal against her back. It wasn't comfortable, but it was essential. It was her weapon, her voice. Now, the next step. The dirt road at the furthest edge of the property. Miles of walking, but every step would take her away from that private hell. Helena left the tool shed, closing the door as silently as possible. The sun was already high, and the heat was becoming oppressive. She needed to move fast before Sophia or any of the employees saw her. The farm, once her home, was now a labyrinth of dangers. She began her journey, keeping to the edge of the forest, avoiding the main paths. Every snap of a branch under her feet was a potential alarm, every shadow a threat. Thirst was relentless, but there was no time for water. Hunger was a hole in her stomach, but the hunger for justice was greater. Suddenly, a sound, a car engine, not the hearse. It was Sophia's SUV. Helena's heart leaped to her throat. She threw herself behind a dense bush, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the main road. The black SUV appeared, coming from the main house, and headed towards the farm's main gate. Sophia was in it, at the wheel. Her profile unmistakable even from a distance. A chill ran through Helena. Sophia was leaving. Where to? To town, perhaps, to continue her theater of mourning. It was a window of opportunity, but also a risk, if Sophia returned, if she saw her. Helena waited until the SUV was out of sight, the sound of the engine fading until it disappeared. She had some time, but not much. The dirt road was her only path. She quickened her pace, the pain in her legs and feet almost unbearable, but determination carried her. She walked for what seemed an eternity, the farm landscape stretching around her, familiar yet strange. The trees seemed to watch her. The birds, their songs, were a soundtrack to her escape. The backpack with the shovel weighed heavily, a constant reminder of her mission. When she finally spotted the old dirt road, a sigh of relief escaped her lips. It was narrow, overgrown in places, rarely used, but it was her freedom. She was almost there. Then a sound, not a car engine, a howl, closer than ever, the Jaguar. Helena stopped, her body paralyzed. It wasn't a howl of threat, but of presence. Suddenly, a movement at the edge of the forest ahead of her. The Jaguar emerged, majestic and silent, its golden eyes fixed on Helena. Helena felt no fear, only a strange connection. The Jaguar was the spirit of those lands, the wild guardian that had rescued her. It was the queen, and Helena now was a part of that untamed kingdom. The Jaguar took a step forward, then another, and then, without warning, turned its head back towards the main house and let out a powerful roar, a sound that made the earth tremble beneath Helena's feet. It was not a hunting roar, but a warning of fury. And then, the unthinkable happened. Sophia's SUV, which Helena thought had left, reappeared on the horizon, coming from the farm's main road. Sophia had returned, or perhaps she had never left, just driven around. She was coming towards the dirt road, perhaps looking for something, or just patrolling her property. The Jaguar, as if it knew, gave another roar, and then, with surprising agility, advanced onto the dirt road, not towards Helena, but towards the path Sophia was about to take. It positioned itself in the middle of the road, a wild and imposing barrier. Sophia braked sharply, the SUV skidding on the dirt. The front tire hit a loose rock and the car swerved, almost leaving the road. Sophia, visibly frightened, honked frantically, trying to scare the beast away, but the Jaguar did not move, its eyes fixed on the vehicle, a silent challenge. Taking advantage of the distraction, Helena ran. She ran as she had never run in her life, the backpack swinging on her back, her cap almost falling off. She passed the Jaguar, which didn't even look at her, focused on its confrontation with Sophia. The beast was giving her the time she needed. The Jaguar was fighting for her. Helena did not look back. She ran down the dirt road, with each step feeling freedom approach. The village, civilization, justice. The jaguar's roar echoed once more, a cry of triumph and farewell. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs threatened to give way. Finally, in the distance, she spotted the first houses of the small village. Smoke rose from a chimney. People. Help. Helena collapsed by the roadside, breathless, exhausted, but alive and victorious. The shovel in her backpack was the irrefutable proof. Sophia, the rich and cruel woman, would be exposed. The inheritance would not be hers. Justice, slow and wild like the jaguar that saved her, would finally reach her. Helena was no longer the prey. She was the survivor, the warrior, and the world now would know the truth. The war had come to an end, and the truth finally would be unearthed.